As headline figures go, it was truly eye-catching. The sort of number that makes you think someone has accidentally added an extra zero, increasing the total by a factor of 10. In late April this year, the British Minister for State for the Armed Forces gave what appeared to be the UK's best estimate for Russian casualties in Ukraine. The figure he quoted? 450,000, not including those killed and wounded while serving for private military companies such as Wagner. A couple of weeks later, in May, the French foreign minister went one further. According to Paris, Russian military casualties in Ukraine have hit 500,000. To be clear, these are casualty figures rather than deaths. While they include those killed, they also cover the wounded and the missing. Still, those are still shocking figures, so high as to be almost unbelievable. And that got us wondering, is there any way to go beyond the estimates to maybe come close to understanding the true death toll of Russian forces in Ukraine? And while this is a massive question that we've actually tackled before, 9 months ago we published a video diving deep into the subject. But with 3/4 of a year of fighting having passed, it's time for an update. And this time, we won't just be focusing on the death toll among Russian forces, but also among the armed forces of Ukraine. Prior to 2022, it was generally understood that the deadliest, most catastrophic war fought by Moscow since World War II had been the Soviet-Afghan War. Running from 1979 to 1989, it killed 15,000 Soviet troops and left perhaps another 35,000 wounded. Although spaced out over 10 years, the high death toll caused such fractures in society that Moscow was forced to ultimately withdraw its war aims unfulfilled. And we mention this now because even by the most conservative estimates, the scale of Russian losses in Ukraine dwarfs those numbers, as it does any other modern war involving Moscow. The two Chechen wars, for example, are thought to have killed 10,000 on the Russian side. The Russo-Georgian War of 2008 didn't even see the Russian death toll hit triple figures. Now compare that to the Ukraine war. According to The Economist, quote, by April 2023, Russia had already lost more soldiers by invading Ukraine than it had in all its combined previous wars since 1945. April 2023, of course, is before some of the bloodiest battles even took place, before the extremely deadly campaign to capture Avdiivka, before Bakhmut even reached its horrific climax. By any sane reckoning, total losses since have likely at least doubled. Yet precise figures are almost impossible to come by. The Kremlin, for example, has only issued one official death toll when it claimed a mere 6,000 dead in September of 2022, a laughable undercount even back then. There are, of course, reasons why the Kremlin would want to keep the true figures hidden. Due to the impact on morale, most states fighting wars try to avoid saying, sorry guys, but just so you know, we have suffered catastrophic losses. Ukraine is also guilty of downplaying its casualties, with President Zelensky recently claiming a mere 31,000 Ukrainian troops have died. The difference, though, is that Ukraine is a relatively open society. Newspapers are free to issue death notices. Municipalities are encouraged to create local memorial lists. That means that anyone with the will and the patience could conceivably sift through multiple sources to reach a somewhat accurate death toll among Ukraine's military, something that we'll be looping back to in a later chapter. In Russia, though, such a thing is harder to do. Wartime laws allow the government to block death notices around sensitive battles and high-casualty Ukrainian strikes, making true figures hard to tease out. And there are real consequences for reporting statistics that Moscow doesn't like. Back in February, pro-war mill blogger Andrei Morozov was found dead of an apparent suicide shortly after publishing casualty figures for the Battle of Avdiivka. As a result, the war's true toll on Russia's people is murky at best, all of which may explain the wild variations among foreign estimates. In the spring, the US government briefed that Moscow had suffered over 315,000 casualties, with the death toll perhaps as high as 120,000. In May, French Foreign Minister Stéphane Sejourne put the figures at 500,000 casualties with 150,000 deaths. Elsewhere, the New York Times reports that various Western intelligence agencies put the figure of Russian dead at well over 100,000. That is a difference of 50,000, the difference between a large town's worth of people living or dying. And that's not even considering whether we can trust the Western estimates in the first place. While the figures could easily be accurate, it's not hard to see why countries like the US, UK, and France might have a vested interest in inflating Russian deaths. Although that's not the same as them actually doing so, you might understand why some take the intelligence estimates with a pinch of salt. Luckily, there are other methods for lifting the veil on Russian casualties, methods that we'll be exploring in the coming chapters. Of all the attempts to dig into Russian casualties, perhaps none is so valuable as the joint investigation carried out by the BBC and independent Russian outlet Media Zona. Started in the early days of the conflict and aided by hundreds of anonymous volunteers, the project aims to create a minimum baseline for the number of Russians killed in Ukraine. Doing so is far from easy. For a dead man's name to make it onto the register, their existence and fate have to be proved beyond all reasonable doubt. That means the database doesn't contain grainy images of dead bodies shot from a distance and counted as a kill. Instead, volunteers comb local Russian media for things like death notices and monitor social media for posts from grieving family members. Out in the real world, they travel to the country to photograph new graves in military cemeteries and check for names added to small-town war memorials. The result is the gold standard list for Russian casualties. If a name appears on there, you can guarantee that it belonged to a real person, that they really went and fought in Ukraine, and that they really died. The flip side, of course, is that the list likely represents a severe undercount, something both the BBC and Media Zona freely admit. Not only is this labor-intensive work that can be limited by multiple factors, but it also only covers those soldiers from Russia itself. Two of the Kremlin's major allies in this war have been the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, the separatist states that split off from Ukraine in 2014. Although they each supplied tens of thousands of fighters on Putin's side, the project's volunteers are unable to replicate their work in the two pseudo-states. As the BBC explains, if they were added, the death toll on the Russian side would be even higher. With that in mind, we can now turn to the most up-to-date figures available at the time of writing. On their blog, Media Zona last updated the list on May 24, 2024. On that day, the number of Russian soldiers confirmed dead had reached 54,185. By way of comparison, that's nearly as high as the total number of American military deaths during the Vietnam War. Given we know it's an undercount, the reasonable assumption is that Russia has, in slightly over 2 years, lost more of its sons in Ukraine than the USA did across almost 2 decades in Vietnam. In an article published this April to coincide with their count hitting 50,000, the BBC tried to analyze why the fighting has been so deadly for the Kremlin. Their major conclusion is that it's down to a lack of professional, well-trained soldiers. So catastrophic was the initial run at Kiev during the war's opening months that many of Russia's most experienced, most capable troops were effectively taken off the board. In their place came prisoners, volunteers, and mobilized men with sharply lower levels of ability. As Samuel Cranny Evans of the Royal United Services Institute told the BBC, this means they have to do things that are a lot simpler tactically, which generally seems to be a forward assault onto Ukrainian positions with artillery support. This tactic is known as the meat grinder for the astonishing level of casualties it incurs. The BBC explains it this way. Moscow sends waves of soldiers forward relentlessly to try to wear down Ukrainian forces and expose their locations to Russian artillery. For this reason, it's the big assaults on fortified cities that send the number of names on this list skyrocketing. Armed with death dates for many of those killed, the BBC report shows 3 huge spikes. During the Battle of Bakhmut in the spring of 2023, during the failed assault on Volodar that same year, and during the battle for Avdiivka a few months ago. Taken together, these 3 battles are a major part of the reason why the second year of the war was deadlier for Russia than the first. It was also insanely deadly for Russia's most infamous units, the Storm Z battalions composed of prisoners. When Wagner first offered convicts the chance to fight for 6 months to earn their freedom, incredibly, it seems today that Wagner's offer was the more humane one. Since the Russian MOD took over the prisoner battalions, the BBC reports that life expectancy among former inmates fighting in Ukraine has dropped from 3 months to just 2. The promise of freedom after 6 months has also been scrapped, replaced with contracts that will only expire once the war ends. This is likely a major reason why Putin has been so far able to ride out the impact of over 54,000 dead. Drawn from prisons and Russia's poorest regions, the dead are simply, sadly, not the sort of people the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg care about. So, if 54,185 is the bare minimum number of Russian deaths in Ukraine, what might the real figure be? Well, to answer that, we need to turn to the field of statistical analysis, a field which 2 independent Russian outlets have used to reach what appears to be a grimly accurate total. Alright, so if you watched our original video on Russian losses back in August of last year, 2023, you might well remember the collaboration between Media Zona, news platform Meduza, and excess mortality researcher Dmitry Kobak at the University of Tübingen. And if you do remember it, that's probably because it was so ingenious. Using Russia's probate registry, the team were able to track spikes in inheritance claims that went above normal levels. Under Russian law, relatives of the dead have 6 months to log their claims, which means people are incentivized to do so in a timely manner. At the same time, the near total lack of female fighting among Moscow's forces meant the team could control for other variables that might be causing a spike, such as the lingering effects of COVID, since these would affect both genders. Here's how it was summed up last time. If the spike was only among men, that would suggest something was killing young men but leaving young women untouched. Something like a gigantic war. Given that the registry goes back to 2014 and contains more than 11 million individual cases, the team are extremely confident that they built a workable model, one that's able to filter out background noise and create a likely range of deaths for the Kremlin's forces. Of course, that's only the basic explanation. If you want an in-depth look at the mechanics of it, all written by actual statisticians, an overview is available on the Medusa website. Do check it out. For our purposes, though, it's the headline figure that counts here. Updated less regularly than the BBC recorded name total, the most recent figures are from March 15th, that's almost 3 months ago, but they're still large enough to stop you in your tracks. According to the statistical model, Moscow's forces, by that point, had suffered around 85,000 deaths. We say around here because the figure is just the midpoint in a range that goes from a possible low of 76,000 to a potential high of 98,000. Like the BBC count in the last chapter, it also only covers Russian citizens. That means that, again, militia members from the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics who fought and died for the Kremlin have been excluded, as have men recruited from Central Asian states and places as far afield as Nepal who are fighting on Russia's side. The figures are also now pretty out of date, although that doesn't necessarily stop us from making an educated guess at where they are today. When they published a big report on the probate registry figures to coincide with the war's second anniversary, MediaZona only had figures up to January 1st, 2024. So the team simply took a rough monthly death toll of 3,900 men for men under 50 in the Russian armed forces and added it twice to account for the missing months. If we do the same now, that would give us a mid-range of 93,000 dead by the end of May. Obviously, this is a pretty crude method of covering the missing 2 months' worth of data. Not only does it fail to account for major battles that have happened since, such as around Kharkiv, but it also fails to account for the severe ammo shortages Ukraine experienced around this time. Shortages that may have made it much harder for Kiev's forces to kill advancing Russians. But even if we stick with just the March figure of 85,000, that is still a hell of a lot of lives lost. To give you just some idea of the scale of death we're talking about here, consider this. If you add the total combat deaths among American forces in both Vietnam and the Korean War, you get just over 81,000. Combined US involvement in those wars covered about 23 years. The Ukraine war, by contrast, has been running for slightly over 2. The data suggests that the reasons for these staggering figures are the same as we covered in the previous chapter, namely the use of mobilized men and prisoners in dramatic battles where Moscow won by sheer numerical advantage. During the early push to capture Bakhmut from January to March 2023, the probate registry data shows about 2,000 Russians were dying across the front every single week. When Avdiivka was captured, the number of deaths also jumped. At the time, Russian mill blogger Andrei Morozov claimed the battle had killed or wounded as many as 16,000 men. Speaking of which, this dataset might be able to tell us more than merely the number of lives lost. It might also be able to tell us how many have been wounded. Now, the method here is especially crude and should not be taken with as much trust as the death count. Back when they first published their dataset, Medusa and MediaZona estimated a rough killed-to-wounded ratio for Russian forces. Their conclusion? For every soldier killed on the Kremlin side, between 1.7 and 2 more men were wounded. Obviously, the idea of 1.7 men being wounded is somewhat amusing, but as a ratio it can be useful. Rather than update their work since, the team now simply applies that to their headline figure. With 85,000 dead, that would imply a bare minimum of another 144,500 men wounded, bringing Moscow's total casualties in the war to nearly 230,000. At the high end of both estimates, with 98,000 dead and twice as many wounded, it would mean almost 300,000 Russian casualties by the middle of March. Again, don't take this figure on trust, as MediaZona themselves have written, quoting, "This estimate for wounded personnel is much less precise than our fatality figures." Nonetheless, it gives us an extremely rough figure we can latch onto, one that is missing the killed and wounded from the Donetsk and Luhansk militias, but is still staggering. Not quite the 500,000 casualties claimed by French intelligence, but still a number so vast it towers over all other European conflicts fought since 1945. And this is still only the Russian casualty figures we're talking about here. It's time then to turn our focus onto the other side of fighting in this war, the Ukrainians. Remember back in chapter 1 today when we explained how a relative lack of wartime censorship means anyone could probably compile a list of Ukraine's dead without too much trouble? Well, meet the website that's doing exactly that. UA Losses is an anonymous database that collates information garnered from newspapers and social media about confirmed Ukrainian deaths. First appearing on December 31st last year, it has no contact information, does not respond to inquiries, and is run out of St. Kitts and Nevis. In other words, everything about it should probably scream Russian information operation. And yet, most senior researchers seem to think it's actually real. Volunteers from the Ukrainian-run Book of Memory, intended to memorialize Kiev's dead, say a lot of their info overlaps with that of UA Losses. When Media's owner and Medusa tried pulling out a random sampling of 400 entries, they found that nearly all were backed up with reliable, publicly verifiable data. Of the first 40,000 names on the list, separate researchers only found 1,700 duplicates. As such, many now believe that UA Losses may be the Ukrainian version of the BBC's Recorded Names project, the gold standard, bare minimum baseline for Ukrainian deaths in the war. And that makes it invaluable, because previous estimates of the death toll among Ukraine's forces have been wildly biased in both directions. On the optimistic side, there's Zelensky's public estimate of 31,000 Ukrainians killed, a total so laughably low we can pretty much just dismiss it immediately. At the other end of the scale, former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu claimed in February that Kiev had suffered 444,000 deaths, a number so absurdly inflated that not even a buffoon like Shoigu could actually believe it. Between these extremes lie plenty of other estimates, all of which are more believable, but also are either prone to bias or impossible to verify. For example, pro-war Russian mill blogger Rybar has been running his own database, but swaths of entries contain little or no identifying details and no way to connect names to publicly available information. Likewise, American intelligence estimates of 70,000 dead Ukrainians by the end of last summer are also impossible to verify. So, until the war is over and archives are finally open to military historians, projects like UA Losses are likely the best that we're going to get. And at the time of writing, its numbers are stark. According to the anonymous hosts, they have so far verified the deaths of 51,245 Ukrainian troops. Before we dig into that number a bit further, we first have to quickly highlight a couple of things. One is that the count includes Ukrainian troops who died in the Donbass war that kicked off in 2014 and led directly to the current conflict. That means 4,795 of their entries are soldiers who died before the full-scale invasion began. Remove their names, and the total since the 24th of February 2022 drops to 46,450. The second thing to note is that UA Losses updates way less frequently than the BBC recorded names count. During the time it took us to research and write this video, the BBC count updated once. UA Losses, by contrast, remained static. That means it's likely missing many of the recent Ukrainian losses, which during a time of shell hunger may have been higher than usual. Nonetheless, it does remain a useful resource, one that we can gain some interesting insights from. For example, MediaZona used their data to create a chart showing how Kiev's losses differed from month to month. If accurate, it would suggest that we need to rewrite the narrative of the war's earliest days. Apart from a major spike in Russian deaths corresponding to the disastrous first week of the invasion, the death toll for Ukraine's forces was actually higher than for Moscow's for most of that spring and summer. This is fascinating because the narrative we currently have is that Ukraine only started incurring truly massive casualties when it made the decision to try and hold Bakhmut as long as possible. But the UA Losses data suggests that by early April of 2022, Kiev was already losing more men than Moscow. In fact, the Ukrainian casualty count seems to have been high throughout the war, resulting in eye-watering but steady losses. Even during the failed counter-offensive of summer 2023, the losses seem to have remained consistent rather than spiking wildly. And yes, we know, high Ukrainian losses in the conflict's opening weeks, but no particular spike in mid-2023 is pretty much the exact opposite of the media narrative surrounding this war. It'll be interesting to see if future scholarship backs these figures up. For now, though, we can turn to the obvious question, the one that you're likely asking yourself. If these figures are equivalent of the BBC recorded names list, a bare minimum, then what's the equivalent of the Russian probate registry dataset? In other words, how many Ukrainians have really died since Russia's onslaught began? Because of the vast difference between the figures in the BBC database and the probate registry database for Russian forces, you might now be expecting to hear that a similar difference exists on the Ukrainian side, that maybe the number of casualties suffered by Kiev and Moscow are closer than anyone realizes. However, there are good reasons for assuming that that's not the case. The probate registry method was required for analyzing Russian deaths because of all the reporting restrictions. In Ukraine, it's far easier to find death notices or memorial lists that are reasonably accurate. That means the UA losses database will be closer to the actual figure than the BBC recorded names database. Although exactly how close is open to debate. Here's how Medusa describes it. It is unlikely that the UA losses list is complete. Medusa estimates that the range of open source dead to real dead could be anywhere from 1-to-1 to 2-to-1. So, in the best possible world for Ukraine, that would mean the country has lost only as many as are present in the database, 46,450. In the worst possible world, it would mean that Ukrainian deaths are a lot closer to Russian deaths than anyone in Kiev would like to admit. As usual with these things, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. More interesting, maybe figuring out the difference between deaths in Ukraine and Russia's forces. Here's Medusa once again. If we assume the unlikely scenario in which the UA losses database is complete, the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian fatalities is 1.8 to 2-to-1. According to Medusa's calculations, this is the maximum possible estimate from above in favor of Ukraine. This would seem to counter the prevalent narrative that 5 Russians are dying for every 1 Ukrainian killed, something Zelensky himself claimed. At most, it instead appears that 2 Russians die for every Ukrainian defender. And in all likelihood, the ratio is not even that high. Yet whatever the true ratio is, there's no denying one major point, that this is an exceptionally bloody war, one in which people's fathers, sons, and brothers are dying at a terrible rate. It's easy to forget amid the endless grind of a brutal war that there's a face behind these statistics, that each number on the death tolls that we've discussed in this video represents a real person, a real human being who in another timeline would still be alive, a person with a family and friends and people who cared about them, all of whom now have nothing but a hole in their lives where their loved one used to be. And for what? So an old man in the Kremlin can live out his fantasies of imperial grandeur? The sad fact is that were the West to halt weapons supplies to Ukraine tomorrow, the killing would not stop. It would simply become more efficient on the Russian side, leading to faster deaths among Kiev's troops as Moscow's war machine swept westward. Conversely, were Putin to wake up tomorrow and decide to withdraw his troops, then the war would end. The killing would stop, and would no longer have to publish video updates on this topic, tracking the grief of hundreds of thousands of families across Ukraine and Russia. Of course, such a thing is unlikely to ever happen. In all probability, we'll be putting out another update in 9 months' time covering all those who've died since. Likely or not, though, it's important that we remember who is ultimately responsible for all of this suffering. Important that we never forget the misery that Vladimir Putin has already inflicted upon so many in his bloody and meaningless war, a war we can only pray ends as soon as possible.